June 24, 2021. Just after 3 a.m. Surfside, Florida. A 12-story beachfront condominium known as Champlain Towers South partially collapses while residents sleep inside. 98 people are killed. There is no storm, no explosion, no visible warning that night that would explain, on its own, why a residential tower folds into rubble in seconds. The physical trigger, according to a NIST investigation released in 2026, did not begin that morning at all. It began weeks earlier, underground, in a part of the structure most residents never saw and never thought about, the concrete slab beneath the pool deck. NIST identified punching shear failure in two column-to-slab connections in that area as the starting point. Punching shear is a specific structural failure mode where a column effectively punches through a flat concrete slab because the slab cannot carry the load around the connection. NIST found that this failure did not happen instantly on the night of the collapse. It developed over weeks, quietly, before triggering a chain reaction that traveled up through the tower and brought down a significant portion of the building. This script is not about that night in isolation. It is about the years of decisions, financial and administrative, that preceded it. Because a punching shear failure beneath a pool deck does not appear out of nowhere. It appears where water has been getting in, where steel has been corroding, where repairs have been priced, approved, and then delayed. The story of Champlain Towers South is, at its foundation, a story about what happens when the gap between identifying a problem and actually paying to fix it is allowed to stretch for years. Over the next several minutes, we will walk through the technical failure NIST documented, the construction and design deviations that made the structure more vulnerable than it should have been, the financial and governance history of the condo association that controlled the repair timeline, and the human cost of the gap between diagnosis and action. None of this is speculation. It is drawn directly from NIST's technical findings and public financial records tied to the building's condo association. NIST's technical findings did not stop at identifying where the collapse began. The investigation also examined how the building was designed and how it was actually built, and found severe deviations in both places. First, between the original structural design and the applicable building codes at the time of construction. Second, and separately, between the structural design drawings and what was actually constructed. NIST documented misplaced reinforcement and fewer rebars than the design specified. In plain terms, the steel bars meant to reinforce the concrete were not always where the plans said they should be, and in some cases there were simply fewer of them than called for. This matters because reinforcement is what allows concrete to resist the kind of stress that develops around a column-to-slab connection under load. A slab with less reinforcement than designed, sitting in an area already vulnerable to punching shear, has less capacity to resist that failure mode when it begins to develop. These construction and design deviations were not something discovered the week of the collapse. They were built into the structure from the start, decades before NIST's report, sitting latent until conditions elsewhere in the building activated them. And conditions elsewhere in the building were also documented, separately, for years. Water infiltration and reinforcement corrosion in the garage beneath the pool deck had been reported since 2018. This is not a single inspection note. It is a multi-year pattern, tracked by the people responsible for maintaining the building, describing water getting into the structure and steel inside it corroding as a result. By April 2021, roughly 2 months before the collapse, that same condition was described as much worse. So by the spring of 2021, the people managing the building had a documented, worsening report of water infiltration and corrosion in the exact area beneath the pool deck, where NIST would later locate the origin of the punching shear failure. A $15 million repair program had in fact been approved before the collapse. On paper, the problem had been identified, priced, and authorized, but the main structural work under that program had not begun when the building fell. The gap between an approved repair program and unstarted structural work is not a technical detail. It is the entire story. The physical failure NIST traced back weeks before June 24th did not happen despite a plan to fix it. It happened while that plan was still sitting on paper, with the corrosion it was meant to address getting worse, not better, in the months leading up to the collapse. To understand why $15 million in approved repairs never reached the structural work, you have to look at the Condo Association's finances years before the collapse. A March 2020 independent reserve study, conducted more than a year before the collapse, found the Condo Association held only 6.9% of the recommended reserve funding. In dollar terms, that was roughly $706,000 to $777,000 held against approximately $10.3 million that the study recommended to cover necessary repairs. That same 2020 study did not describe a building in good condition with a funding shortfall. It rated several building components, including the garage and the entrance, as having 0 years of remaining useful life. 0 years. Not deteriorating, not approaching the end of its service life, but already there, according to the association's own commission study, over a year before the collapse. How does a building's reserve fund end up at 6.9% of what a professional study says it needs? Florida law provided a specific mechanism. Florida Condominium Act Section 718.112 allowed condo boards to waive mandatory reserve funding by a simple majority vote of owners present at a meeting. This was not a loophole exploited in secret. It was a legal, available option, and it is the kind of mechanism that allows a board facing owner resistance to routine cost increases to defer that cost into the future instead of confronting it in the present. Owner pushback over repair costs also produced direct governance turnover. Board members resigned and a new board took over. But turnover has its own cost: time. By the time the new board was ready to start work, the repair cost estimate had grown to more than $15 million, up from whatever earlier, cheaper figure the outgoing board had been contending with. Every month spent in transition was a month the underlying corrosion and water infiltration continued, and a month the eventual price tag climbed. Financing added another layer of delay. 2 major lenders declined to loan the Condo Association money in December 2020. It was not until March 2021, 3 months later, that the board secured a $12 million loan. The $15 million special assessment, approved in April 2021, was designed specifically to repay that loan. So the full financing structure to pay for structural repairs was not even in place until roughly 2 months before the building collapsed. Reserve underfunding created the initial shortfall. A legal waiver provision let boards defer the underlying obligation for years. Board turnover consumed additional time while costs rose. And lender rejection added a further 3-month delay to securing financing at all. Each of these was, on its own, an administrative or financial event. Together, they describe a repair program that was always behind the physical deterioration it was meant to address. At the moment the building collapsed, the $15 million special assessment had been approved for 2 months. The loan meant to fund it had been in place for roughly 3 months. And the main structural repair work, the work targeting the garage and the area beneath the pool deck where NIST would later locate the origin of the collapse, had not been contracted. The board was still collecting contractor bids for that structural work when the tower came down. Meanwhile, lower priority roof repairs had already begun. This detail is not incidental. It shows a repair program that was, at the point of collapse, actively underway on the building, just not on the part of the building that mattered most. Resources and schedule had moved forward on visible, less urgent work, while the process for addressing the specific structural deterioration flagged since 2018 was still in the procurement stage, still gathering bids, still administrative. For the 98 people who died, the sequencing question was not abstract. It was the difference between a repair completed and a repair still being priced. The water infiltration and corrosion reported since 2018 had nearly 3.5 years to worsen before the collapse. The reserve study warning of 0 years of remaining useful life in the garage had over a year to sit on record before ground was broken on the work it called for. None of the individual delays described in the script, the reserve shortfall, the legal waiver provision, the board resignations, the lender rejections, the ongoing bid collection, was itself the structural cause NIST identified. The structural cause was a punching shear failure in 2 column-to-slab connections, worsened by construction that deviated from its own design drawings. But the financial and governance history explains why that structural vulnerability was still sitting there, undressed, on the night it finally gave way. A building does not repair itself on the timeline that its deterioration demands. It repairs on the timeline that its funding, its financing, its board continuity, and its contracting process allow. In this case, that timeline was measured in years of underfunded reserves, months of lender rejection, and, in the final stretch, an active bidding process that had not yet produced a signed contract for the work that mattered most. The people inside Champlain Towers South on the night of June 24, 2021, were living inside the gap between those two timelines. The physical one, tracked in NISD's account of weeks of developing failure, and the administrative one, tracked in years of reserve studies, board turnover, and financing delays. That gap is where the 98 deaths occurred. What NIST's 2026 findings establish is a chain that starts with two specific column-to-slab connections beneath a pool deck and ends with a partial collapse that killed 98 people. What the financial and governance record establishes, separately, is why that chain was allowed to run its full course. The deviations between design and code, and between design drawings and actual construction, including misplaced reinforcement and fewer rebars than specified, were structural facts built into the tower from its construction. They were not something a condo board in 2018 or 2020 could have retroactively fixed. But the water infiltration and corrosion reported since 2018, described as much worse by April 2021, was exactly the kind of deteriorating condition that ongoing maintenance and timely structural repair exist to address. The record shows that the association's reserve fund held less than 7% of what an independent study said was needed. That state law permitted boards to legally waive the requirement to fund reserves adequately. That board turnover consumed time while the repair estimate grew past $15 million. That lenders twice said no before financing was finally secured. And that even after financing closed, the highest priority structural work was still out for contractor bids when the building fell. Each of these facts, read on its own, describes a normal, survivable delay of the kind that happens in condo associations across the country. Read together, in sequence, against the backdrop of a documented and worsening structural condition, they describe a repair program that never closed the distance between identifying the problem and fixing it. This script has not assigned individual blame to any board member, lender, or contractor, because the facts available do not support doing so. What they do support is a clear timeline, a structural vulnerability documented for years, a funding shortfall documented in writing over a year before the collapse, and a structural contract still in the bidding stage on the night the building came down. Champlain Towers South stood for decades before that night. The forces that brought it down, according to NIST, developed over weeks. But the conditions that allowed those weeks to matter, the corrosion no one had yet paid to fix, the reserve account that never held what it needed to hold, developed over years, documented the entire time in reserve studies, inspection reports, and board minutes that are now part of the public record. That is the story this case leaves behind. Not a sudden, unforeseeable failure, but a documented, worsening condition running on a slower clock than the one required to fix it.